I want to talk to the person who lay awake at last night and worried about some problem that they're experiencing, or got up this morning with a cup of coffee and stared out the window and had a hard time getting out of that chair, kind of wondering how they're going to get through it. And what I want to say is, I was where you are, and I went out and I met hundreds of people who are where you are, and frankly, in many cases, a lot worse. And it's not just that meeting them gave me hope, because it did do that, but it gave me practical things that I can do tonight, tomorrow, next week, 6 months from now. Because what I learned is that life gets you stuck, and the life transition is how you get unstuck. So whatever you're dealing with, I want to say, if you come on this journey with me, I'm going to help you feel, whatever transition you're going through, we're going to make it go a little bit more easily and a lot more effectively. We can get through this time together. There is wisdom out there that can help.
Welcome back to another episode of Health and Humanity. Today's guest is one of America's most popular voices on contemporary life. He is the author of 7 New York Times bestsellers, the presenter of 2 primetime series on PBS, and the inspiration for the drama series Council of Dads on NBC. Bruce's 2 TED Talks have been viewed more than 2 million times. Employing a first-hand approach to his work, Bruce is known for living the experiences he writes about. His work combines timeless wisdom with the timely knowledge to allow people to live with more meaning, passion, and joy. His new book, which is a top 10 New York Times bestseller, Life is in the Transitions, Mastering Change at Any Age, describes his journey across America, collecting hundreds of life stories, exploring how we can navigate the growing number of life transitions with great purpose and skill. Bruce Feiler is our guest today. He's native of Savannah, Georgia, and lives in Brooklyn with his wife, Linda, and their identical twin daughters. For more information, please visit brucefeiler.com. Bruce, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into our conversation and talking a little bit more about your new book, Life is in the Transitions. And let's start there. Obviously, 2020 has been a year filled with a lot of change, a lot of transitions for so many people. And of course, you didn't predict everything that happened this year. At least I don't think you necessarily did. But I'm sure the book started several years back, where you started piecing together all these different stories and talking about this topic of going through transition. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about that and how that kind of all started for you in terms of that dialogue of talking about transition and change?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me and for that thoughtful introduction. And I'll answer the question this way by saying that we are in this life quake, I call it, which is this kind of period of massive change that's sort of higher on the Richter scale of consequences and has aftershocks that last for years. And I got interested in this kind of period and sort of these sort of tumultuous kind of periods of upheaval in our lives because I went through one myself. So, this started more than a dozen years ago at this point. So I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. As you just mentioned, I left there and I went to Yale. So I went to the Northeast to college. Then I moved to Japan. And I appeared to be older than you are, but I started writing letters home on crinkly airmail paper. This was obviously before the internet and before email. And when I got back to Georgia, everywhere I went, people said, "I loved your letters." I was like, "Great. Have we met?" And it turned out that my grandmother had Xeroxed them and passed them around, and they went sort of viral in an old-fashioned sense of the word. And I thought, well, this is that interesting to me and all these people. I should write a book about it. So it doesn't happen this way, but I sold my first book 31 years ago this month, and this is all that I've ever done. So in my 20s, I wrote books about Japan and country music. I was a circus clown. In my 30s, I went back and forth to the Middle East, writing books about religion, and that was in the wake of 9/11, and so there was all this kind of tumult, are we going to be in a religious war? I got married, and I had children, and this is sort of the conventional, sort of linear, kind of the fantasy life that we all think we're going to have. But then in my 40s, as you just alluded to, I just got walloped by life. First, I got cancer, as you know,
Mm.
as a new dad. And I asked a group of friends to form a Council of Dads, which became this new series on NBC. Then I almost went bankrupt in the last recession. And then my dad, who has Parkinson's, tried to take his own life 6 times in 12 weeks. This happened. And, these, I like difficult conversations as you do, but like this was like the conversations were unhavable, basically.
Right.
But I'm the story guy and the meaning guy. So kind of on one Monday morning, I sent my dad a question like, tell me about the toys you played with. And he couldn't even move his fingers, but he dictated his answer to Siri. And then it helped bring him back to life. And so I sent another and another. And this went on for 5 years until he basically backed into writing an autobiography. And when I would share this story, everybody had a similar story. My wife had a headache and went to the hospital and died, or my daughter has an anxiety disorder, my brother's stage 4, whatever it was, my boss is a crook. Like everybody was saying in some way or another, like the life I'm living is not the life I expected. I'm living life out of order in some way. And so that's when I began to realize that no one knows how to tell their life story anymore. And that's what propelled me on this journey, collecting life stories across the country.
Yeah, it's super, super fascinating. With the term lifequake, is it something that we all experience as humans? I don't think it's quite possible for anyone to necessarily go through life and not experience what you call lifequake. Is that correct?
Well, I think that the short answer is yes. I mean, I think that lifequakes, and we can get into this in this conversation, that some of them are expected, some are unexpected, some are voluntary. I mentioned earlier, I think you said it in the intro, like I'm the dad of identical girls that are 15.
Mm-hmm.
That was a lifequake, becoming a dad of identical twins, right? I mean, it was joyful, but it changed everything about our lives.
Right.
And, so when I ultimately kind of did the analytics of all this, and I'll kind of take a step back in a second and explain all the process, it turns out that 53% of the lifequakes that we go through in our lives are involuntary, right? So an involuntary lifequake is a downsizing, a tornado, a diagnosis, a pandemic, but 47% are voluntary, right? So we cheat on a spouse, right? Or we start a new venture, or we move, or we change religions, or sexual orientation, or get out of a bad marriage, or get sober, whatever it is. And so that is interesting, is that a lot of the language, I think one of the reasons that lifequake has been one of the ideas to kind of pop from this book and sort of kind of enter the kind of the conversation, is that most of the ways that people have talked about these kinds of events, crisis, right, stressor, I mean, these are all negative words, but I think that it turns out that a lot are positive. And this sort of gives me a chance to say that when I set out to do this, I wasn't looking for any of this, right? So to go back in the story a little bit before we get too deep into the kind of the findings and like the advice we have to help people, what I did was it was to me, I'm going to go ask people, tell me the story of your life. I mean, it was literally that simple. Tell me the story of your life in 15 minutes. Most people took longer. That was like the first hour. And then I did a whole second hour, high point of your life, your low point, turning point. And then these transitions began to emerge. And then I would dig into them kind of almost granularly. So let's pretend you and I are having one of these conversations. So we've just met, and I'm sort of asking you a series of questions. And then I turn to you and I say, what's the biggest life transition that you've ever been through? What would you say?
I think for me, for a life transition would most likely be career, which right now I'm actually going through a pretty big career change and transition.
So is this so to where is this voluntary or involuntary?
Voluntary.
Okay.
Yep. So voluntary. And what was really interesting, well, you know what? It's actually both, if that's even possible. Is that possible? I think it's both.
Well, let me say this about it. Like, first of all, it's your life transition. You can experience it however you want. The language that I settled on, and again, to sort of set the stage here, what happened was I ended up doing hundreds and hundreds of life interviews, just like we were just doing a sample of. People of all ages, all walks of life, all 50 states. People who lost homes, lost limbs, changed careers, changed religions, got sober, got out of bad marriages. At the end of the day, Dan, I had, as you know, 1,000 hours of interviews. 6,000 pages of transcripts. It came to the shoulders of my adolescent daughters.
Yeah.
And then I got a team of 12 people, and we spent a year coding these stories, looking for ideas and themes and takeaways and tips that could help all of us survive and thrive in times of change. And so, kind of one of the big ideas that emerged from this is that the life quakes that we go through,
Mm-hmm.
they may be voluntary or involuntary. So, and say like the work ones that you talked about, could be that you lose a job, your business closes, you move, and you have to step away, whatever it might be. But that the transition that comes out of it must be voluntary. That's what I would say. Like, so the original instigating circumstance may have been involuntary, but how you choose to react, that's where the voluntary nature of the transition comes from. So anybody listening to us now probably stayed awake last night worrying about something, or got a cup of coffee and stared out the window this morning and was wondering, because we're all going through this now, right? Because I've been working on this for half a decade. And then lo and behold, it emerges at this moment when the entire planet is going through a transition at the same time. So that's what I would say about the life quake. Could be voluntary, involuntary, but if you're going through a transition, odds are you had to make a voluntary choice to go through the steps and the phases and the process to get to turn it into a period of growth and renewal.
That makes sense. So now that I hear you say that, I think the transition itself was involuntary. And I'll explain in a minute why I thought maybe it could have been both. But I think now that my reaction to that transition is more voluntary. So now let me explain the story and the transition I'm going through. So by trade, I'm a wedding photographer. I have this podcast. It's a health podcast. It has nothing to do with weddings. But for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been building up this wedding photography business. And I took the business full time in January of 2019. So it's been, a little over a year and a half, approaching 2 years of full-time business. And I would say at the end of 2019, so around December of 2019, I was experiencing some burnout within my business. I was working long hours. I was working every weekend almost. All of my Saturdays were pretty much gone in terms of social life, hanging out with friends and family, because I was working weddings. And I knew that going into it, and it was something that I had experienced for the last several years. But I think something with last year, maybe it was too many weddings, maybe it was just the lifestyle of it all, and just some of that pressure that is involved in working in the wedding industry. I was experiencing burnout and started having thoughts of, maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I got into an industry and started a business that I don't truly love. But nevertheless, I kind of just, put my head down and kept moving forward. And then, of course, in March of this year, the big global pandemic hit. And as you are probably aware, most things in the entertainment industry and in weddings and events, it all pretty much got postponed or canceled. And that's where I was back in the springtime, was, 24, 25 weddings that were planned for this year. Almost all of them were postponed or canceled. So you're talking just about overnight, your whole income that you were expecting for the year was pretty much dried up. And I don't know if that was just a sign from the universe or what, but I think that's going back to when I said that I think it's a little bit of both, voluntary and involuntary, was that like I was starting to kind of think of maybe pursuing other career paths, and then the involuntary piece of COVID hit. And then that's where I step into my reaction to that transition was, okay, I got all this free time now. I have several months of no work. Let's start up this podcast that I've been thinking about doing, and health is something I'm passionate about, and better relationships is something I'm passionate about. And just living an overall better quality life is something that I was really interested in. So that's how this whole podcast kind of started. And I'm now in a spot where I'm just kind of exploring options of where can I make this a career, something that I can monetize, the podcast, the YouTube channel, a personal brand. So that's kind of where I'm at now.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah,
and
of course.
Good luck. And so here's what I'm hearing in that story, having listened to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these kinds of stories. So the first thing I want to say is I want to take a step back before we talk about the particular situation that you're in, and put this into some kind of larger context. I would say that the big idea that emerged from this endeavor that I've been working on for 5 years is that what I've come to call the linear life, okay, which is to say the expectation that we're going to have one job, one home, one career, one spirituality, one sexuality, one relationship from adolescence to assisted living, like that idea is dead. And for a lot of people, that was the idea that we were raised on.
Right.
One of the interesting sort of kind of subdimensions of all of this is that in my conversations, Xers kind of get this nonlinearity more intuitively than do boomers, and millennials even more than Xers. So the millennials kind of understand that there's going to have 12.7 jobs and 11.4 moves, and that life is going to be nonlinear in this way, whereas the boomers, I was born in 1964, which is sort of the last year of the baby boom nominally. Like we were still raised with the ghost of linearity, with this expectation. Right. So the linear life has been dead, is dead now, and it's been replaced by what I call the nonlinear life, which involves many more of these life transitions. So that my data show we have one disruptor, as I call it, every 12 to 18 months. That's more often than most people see a dentist, by the way. So that's basically, 36 times in our lives we have a change of some magnitude. An accident, a move, a change, getting married, getting divorced, an empty nest, whatever it might be. Most of those we get through. We're pretty good at adapting, but 1 in 10 of those becomes what I call a life quake. So 3 to 5 times in our lives. So no longer the midlife crisis, right? Yep. If you're 39 and a half, as the original midlife crisis idea said, if you're 39 and a half in 2020, in this year of tumult, well, you're having a midlife crisis. But if you're 27 and a half, you're also having a crisis. And if you're 67, or in the case of my daughter's 15, so these things happen across our lives, and they take longer than we think. And one of the reasons my book is called Life is in the Transitions, it's sitting here actually holding my eyeglasses, I'll hold it up. One of the reasons it's called Life is in the Transitions is to say, if we're going to spend half of our lives saying that these are miserable periods that we have to grit and resilience and kind of slog our way through, we are missing the opportunity to turn these into periods of growth and opportunity. It's still going to be painful, but there's chances there. So that's so the first thing I want to say is you're not alone. And this year in particular, you're absolutely not alone.
Sure.
Because this is the first time that there's been this global involuntary life quake in a century. So almost anybody listening to us in their lifetimes, this is the first time that we've all been going through this together.
Yes.
And while that's powerful, let me just also say it's misleading, because as you've just told the story, the transition that you're in is different than the one I'm in, is different than the one she's in and he's in. So we're going through it together, but it's going to affect each of us individually. And so that we both feel a part of something bigger, but also apart from everybody else, because the particulars of our circumstance are different. Yeah. That's also normal.
There's a few things I want to touch on there. I want to touch a little bit more on the idea of linear life and kind of that like societal norm. But before we get there, let's touch, since you just mentioned it, what does that mean? This, like you said, it's really the first time where almost everybody is going through a change all at once. Pre-pandemic, people would have big transitions on their own time, their own schedule. It was kind of just their own life. But now this year, it's like big change for most people all at once. What does that mean for us as a society and as individuals?
Well, I think that I think the first thing that it means is that it's in many ways, not always, but in many ways, it's less isolating. Okay. So that the primary, what we're talking about with a life quake in general is some sort of a breach in the normal. Okay. There's some interruption to the expected normal kind of flow of life. And when that happens to you, a very common feeling is to feel isolated, alone, scared. We're getting a minute into the feelings that people have. And I remember when I had cancer, I'm 43. My cancer is so nonlinear. I have an adult onset pediatric cancer. I was on crutches for 2 years. Wow. I was on a cane for a year after that. And I would look out of my window in Brooklyn where I live, and I would look down at people walking, and I would say, well, you don't have this problem, or you know how to walk, or you're not using crutches, or you're not worrying about dying. And you just feel incredibly alone. And so I think that there is on a very big level, we don't have that feeling of being alone. We're not humiliated to share with people around us that we're having difficulty, because everybody is having difficulty in some level. That doesn't mean you don't have feelings, but I think that that's a very powerful thing. And then the other dimension of it is that everybody else is moving at the same time. So if you're one of the kind of minor findings of my book, I would say is that 61% of people move in the middle of a life transition. Now, I don't know about you, but 61% of the conversations that I'm in, people are talking about moving. And so, but everybody's talking about moving. And it's one of the reasons that it's in the conversation a lot. Like, so everybody, if you were to walk into a gathering of people, of course, we can't have gatherings in this very moment, but, and you say, what are you dealing with? If you said, think about the sort of what's the great American, how are you? I'm fine. Who would say I'm fine? And the answer to that question now.
Right.
So I think that there is a kind of a camaraderie of being discombobulated, a camaraderie of the discombobulated. How's that for a catchy bumper sticker? But I think that that's a powerful thing. So therefore we don't feel stigmatized in some way. And that is no small thing. And let's remember, we're not just going through one life quake. We're going through, and this is another finding of, it's something I talk about a lot in life is in the transitions, is that they tend to clump. Right. So just when you lose your job, you wreck your car, right? Or just when your child needs surgery, your mother has cataract operations, and along comes a hurricane. So these things tend to gather. And if you look at 2020, the pandemic is just one of the life quakes. You then have the economic fallout, as you just described in your case. Then along comes the protest movement that grew out of kind of this, why now? Like the murder of George Floyd, as visual and the fact that it was on tape and powerful as it was, that happens kind of regularly. Why the outpouring? Because our immune system was already weakened by the pandemic, and therefore I think we wanted something to do in this response, and throw into that the politics. So this is a period of incredible kind of psychic change, a psychic shock to the system.
Right.
So, but one of the things that I would say to you, and I would say to anybody listening, is that when you get into this, you're going to feel isolated and alone and scared, even this year.
Right.
But you look at enough of them, as I have, and there are certain patterns. So, for example, life transitions have 3 phases. There's the long goodbye, where you kind of say goodbye, accept that the old life is not coming back, and say goodbye to that. There's the messy middle, where you shed certain habits and begin to experiment with new ones. And then there's the new beginning, where you unveil your new self. So in your case, like maybe the long goodbye was a blunt shock in the sense that along comes the pandemic and 3 dozen people cancel their wedding overnight.
Yep.
But maybe now some have been rescheduled, right? So maybe you can still have a little bit of a finger so that you can have a little bit of financial carryover while you're figuring out the messy middle, which is, okay, what habits are you going to have to shed? Well, you're going to have to shed giving up every Saturday. So you're going to have some life back, right? You're going to have to shed security and not lying awake at night and worrying how you're going to pay the bills.
Yep.
Creativity. Maybe you're going to do new things with your photography that are more personal in nature, right? And maybe less mechanical, like a professional shooting a wedding or whatever, I don't know what else you did, bar mitzvahs or brisses or sweet 16 parties or whatever else paid the bills in that business. But you're also getting to try something new in creativity. So that is the process. The process is confronting the emotions, shedding habits, being creative, starting new experiments. That's, in effect, the toolkit, part of the toolkit that I discovered. And as I said, I didn't go looking for it, but it was very clear to me. And that's what people are embracing in this book, which is actual practical things you can do when you're going through a time like this.
Yeah, I love those three stages that you talk about, and the way you applied it to my situation. It's so clear and makes perfect sense on...
Okay, so here's another question for you.
Yes.
So it turns out everybody's good at one phase and bad at another. So 3 phases, the long goodbye, the messy middle, the new beginning. Which one is your superpower? Which one are you best at?
I think the new beginning. I think I think I have sure, like anybody else, when you go through shock or heartbreak or grief, that what'd you call it, the long goodbye,
Yeah.
that can be tough, right? It's tough to say goodbye to things or strip away things that you've done for a while. But I'm pretty decent, I think, at adapting and letting things go. The messy middle, it can be messy for me.
Right.
It can be tough, that transitional period, but I think I'm really good at saying, like, this is my new reality and my new goals and something I'm excited about, and I'm going to double down on it. So I would say probably the new beginning.
Okay. So that's the big finding here, right? Everybody's good at one. They're superpowered, but they're bad at one, like they're kryptonite. And by the way, for the first 100 years that people talked about life transitions, they said, first, you have to go through the goodbye phase, and you have to go through, I mean, the terms were different. Then you have to go, that's all bunk. Like, you do not have to do them in order. In fact, everyone does them in their own kind of idiosyncratic fingerprint kind of a way. So one of the things I try to do in the book is walk you through the process of figuring out which one you're good at.
Yep.
And let's start there. Like, let's build off some confidence. So from you, it sounds like you shut the door on one business involuntarily,
Yep.
and then open the door on the new one relatively quickly.
Yep.
But that suggests that there's other parts of it that are not good. And so, for example, the people who tend to be good at the new beginning tend to be bad, for example, at the long goodbye or the messy middle. The long goodbye, that's an emotional process, right? So I looked 225 people in the eye, and I said, what was the biggest emotion you struggled with in your time of change? And the number one answer, fear. I'm afraid of what's to come. How can I pay my bills? How am I going to live without my loved one? How am I going to, survive without my legs? Whatever, or without drinking. Number two was sadness. I liked having my job or my loved one or my marriage, or I just like that old life, and I'm just disappointed and it's gone. Number three was shame, which surprised me. And actually, men equally are feeling shame than women, which is kind of not what the literature says. So I'm ashamed that I need to ask for help. I'm ashamed I can't pay my bills. I'm ashamed that I have a child with a drinking problem. I'm ashamed of what I did when I was addicted to opioids and how I acted. So a lot of this, so let me just ask you then. So since we're going to use you as the stand-in for everybody listening to us, what was the biggest emotion that you've been struggling with in this time of transition?
I would say it was fear. And I know you just said that was the biggest one, but when I'm thinking through the emotion, especially that initial shock of getting email after email after email from all of my clients saying, oh, we're not having our wedding this year, and just realizing, how much of an economic impact that would have. Fear was definitely the biggest emotion there.
So now the question becomes, how do people react? Okay. And so some people write their feelings down. That's a way of kind of, expunging them and helping to move beyond them. Some people kind of do what sounds like you did a little bit. I'm this way, like buckle down, stop whining, go to work, like do something else. But interestingly enough, 80% of the people I talk to turned to ritual in some way. They held a ceremony, they sang a song, they buried something in the backyard, they got a tattoo, they went to a sweat lodge. I mean, I talked to a guy, Fred Schlomer in Kentucky, who got out of a loveless marriage after 30 years, actually came out as gay, moved, got into a new relationship. He literally went to a sweat lodge to kind of sweat out the past. I spoke to a woman named Lisa Ray Rosenberg in Los Angeles, who had a really difficult year. She was a bone marrow donor to her brother. She had a big falling out with her mother. She went on 52 first dates. She actually made a spreadsheet of everything she wore on every first date because she only went on 7 second dates, and she didn't want to wear the same thing on the second date that she had worn on the first. Anyway, she's like, my biggest fear was heights, so she jumped out of an airplane. Like, so these are rituals, ways that people express themselves kind of to themselves and to everybody around them. I'm going through a difficult time. It's a little challenging, but this is a gesture to say, I'm going to get through it, and I'm ready for whatever comes next.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I don't know if I necessarily had like a big ritual, but I think I did establish a daily practice during this year that helped me get through a lot of the change I've been going through. And that's just going on a daily walk. And for me, again, that's not like something I was fearful of, but somebody that's always been pretty active into sports. I was into long distance running for a while, and most people around my age, I'm 28, so most people in their 20s and 30s, they like to go to the gym and have a soul crushing workout and lift weights and do, all kinds of cardio stuff and CrossFit and just like be that big tough guy and build muscle. And for me, I'm like, yeah, my form of exercise now is just going on a half-hour walk. And that's been a really awesome, I don't know if it's a ritual, but maybe it is now, that, a daily practice.
So this was interesting. So I said earlier that I'm a boomer nominally. And I originally only wanted to talk to people above 40, actually. I was thinking I needed to talk to people who'd been beaten up by life a little bit.
Sure.
And my wife, who runs an organization called Endeavor, my wife Linda, who works with entrepreneurs around the world and has like 500 basically millennials working for her. She's like, no, you're wrong.
Yeah.
So like, it turns out that, millennials have life stories too. And she was right and I was wrong. So I was talking to a millennial, actually in the room I'm sitting right now, a woman named Ida Benedetto, who had a very kind of complicated life and then actually studies kind of rituals. She wrote a master's thesis after a big breakup and kind of career challenge where she went on wilderness trips. She went to sex parties and she went to do kind of ayahuasca. And she wrote a master's thesis about this. And now she helps corporations have organize events. And she comes out of the world of game design, and she explained to me, and I actually almost never talk about this, but it's actually one of the parts about this book that I like the most, is that she talked about how there are three types of games. And one is sandbox games. So sandbox games, you have like the Sandbox or Farmville or Fortnite, where you have kind of boundaries and then a lot of freedom within. Then there's a quest game, where you go on a journey and you overcome obstacles. And then the other is a cyclical game, like Mario Brothers or Pac-Man for older people, where you kind of do the same, or Angry Birds. And it turns out this is how people structure their time. Again, so what is a life quake and a life transition but a breach in the normal? So there are three ways that people structure their time or kind of activities. So one is they do a sandbox. And so like the sandbox people, like I talked to a woman who got divorced after her husband died, leaving her with 3 children under 6. This was the early 70s. She'd only had sexual relations with her husband because, of course, that was the norm back then. So she slept around and experimented sexually because her life had been kind of more confined. Some people use experimental drugs and times like that. Other people go on a quest. So a quest would be taking a course, a 12-step program, something with kind of a beginning and a middle and an end to say, okay, this is how I'm going to get to it. And then other people do what you did, which is something cyclical, okay? Meditation, religious practice, something where on a regular basis. So this walk of yours is a kind of way of structuring time when suddenly you have all this time kind of, I don't know, unfurling before you, unstructured. Taking a walk not only is healthy and gets you out and clears your mind, but it also gives you some structure in the middle of your day. I talked to somebody also in this room who had parents were divorced, back and forth, kind of beaten up by life, went to college too early, dropped out, then went to college and graduate school, got married, had a child, and then when his child was 9 months old, the nanny put the 9-month-old down for a nap, and the 9-month-old never woke up. Whoa. And so this was a huge, massive life quake, as you might imagine. And he told me, Aaron Kaufman is his name, and his story is, I save it till the very end. It was actually helped inspire this project, but it's I told it at the very end of my book. And he told me that in though 61% of life transitions have moved, they were going to move and they canceled a move actually. And so they created lots of things, like someone had told them losing a child to take like a bowl, and every time you have a memory, like a fish bowl, and every time you have a memory of the child, put it in the fish bowl so that you have it for later, right? They use obviously rituals and funerals and things like that. But he told me he got a tattoo to remind himself at the end of a year, to remind himself to always be connected to his lost child. But I was talking about time. So he told me the story that there was a police investigation of the nanny. It later cleared the nanny. It was just one of those, the kid didn't wake up. But he said that one day, like a week or so in, the detective was supposed to come to the house to interview the parents at like 11 a.m. about what happened. And then the detective had to cancel because something else came up. And he said his wife just broke down hysterical and started crying like, this is the one thing that we knew was going to happen today, and it's gone. And how are we going to fill this day? So again, a lot of this process and the tools that I try to outline in the book are ways of normalizing something that seems abnormal.
Yeah. Wow. That's a really powerful story. Thank you for sharing that. Obviously, it's not an easy thing for anyone to deal with. That kind of brings me to my next question is, you've talked to so many different people for your book and had so many conversations, not even just for the book, but just in life. You know, it seems like you're a conversationalist and you enjoy learning about people and their lives.
Good observation.
and their troubles. And I guess my question is, what is it that you find in people that may be going through a tough time, or maybe they have a rough upbringing, or they're going through a really difficult transition? What is it that allows you to see the good in people, that humanity piece, for you to say, you know, you're going through something tough, but you can get through this?
You know, you brought up something earlier that triggered a thought that I think helps answer this question. And the thought was about the linear and the nonlinear. And you know, what I wanted to say at that time is that the idea of a linear life, that turns out to have been the aberration. So if you go back to the ancient world, I mentioned earlier, I spent a lot of time in the ancient world, back and forth to the Middle East. I wrote 5 books about the Bible and religion and modern day spirituality in some ways. They didn't have linear time, right? So they believed that life was a cycle, to every season, turn. And then if you go to the Middle Ages, you know, the Bible sort of introduces in the West the idea of linear time. And if you go to the Middle Ages, they believed that life was a staircase up to middle age and then a staircase down. Okay? So that means you're peaking at middle age. No new love at 40, no starting over like you're doing right now at 50, no retiring and moving to Florida and starting a B&B, whatever it might be. Right. Like, it's straight up, it was incredibly unforgiving. And it was really with the birth of science 100 years ago that we sort of first have this idea that life is going to proceed in a set of linear stages. Freud said it with sex, Piaget said it with childhood development, Eric says it with adult moral development, the 5 stages of grief, the hero's journey. These were all kind of linear constructs. That turns out to be false. And I think that it gave us this expectation that life could be predictable and all problems could be solved, and that was only supercharged by technology, the internet. We have a supercomputer in the form of our phone in our pockets all the time. There's an app for that. You can Google any problem. Like this, we sort of replaced an understanding of the world which had pain and difficulty and setbacks in it with this idea that every problem can be solved. Just Google it and an answer will appear. Right. So what I want to say is that the idea that so when you say, how can I be hopeful that we're going to get through painful times? What I'm saying is that we're going to go through painful times and we have a choice. We can be overcome by them, overwhelmed by them, defeated by them, and say, okay, I'm just going to turn off my mind and grit or grind or grovel or slog my way through it in some way. Or we can say, I'm going to try to make something of this period. Because if you go back to what I said earlier, that there's 3 to 5 life quakes in the course of our lives. And what I didn't say, in part because I a little bit wanted to protect you because you're going through one now, but what I didn't say is that the average length of them is 5 years.
Yeah.
So if you think 3, 4, 5 of these, they take 3, 4, 5 years.
Right.
That's 25 years. That's half of our adult lives. We are in a life transition. If we just say these are miserable periods, we're going to be miserable for half of our lives.
Right.
I'll say that slower. If we just say we're going to be miserable, we're going to be miserable for half of our lives. Okay? And so What I'm saying is that I talked to hundreds of people. 90% of them got through their difficult time and said their life transition was over. And the
Mm,
people who didn't were people, if I had to be talking to you, you're just in the beginning of it. And so you're already underway, but you're going to have some ups and downs because the transitions themselves are not linear.
right.
So this is not some Pollyanna pie in the sky dreamboat scenario. This is based on talking to people who went through, frankly, things far worse than you're going through now.
Hmm.
People who were in cults, people who were in hate groups covered in Nazi propaganda on their bodies, who managed to get out. Christian Picciolini now help people get out.
Yep.
People who were in abusive marriages for dozens of years, abused by their spouses, and then secretly, in the case of Freddie Reese, tucked money away into a total whole grain cereal box until she was able to escape with her children, enrolled in school, and got out of an ultra Orthodox community in New Jersey, and now helps people avoid childhood marriage. People who were in cult, people who were in bad marriages, people who lost their children. I mean, things that would. I mean, one of the reactions people have to this book is, I'm kind of lucky. Mine seems a little low grade
Right.
compared to some of the ones I'm hearing about here.
Yeah. And that's actually the first thought that came to my mind as you're talking through all of this, is that I'm starting to wonder if, like, what I'm going through this year, which has been a lot of change in terms of career change. Also, just open up a little bit further. I'm also going through another big life transition, leaving a relationship that I was in for 2 years. My girlfriend and I recently broke up, so there's a lot that's going on
Pile
right
up,
now.
pile up. Sorry,
Pile it
up.
up. Yeah, I mean, like you said earlier, like when one thing happens, it's like the next thing happens, and then the next. It's just like all at once almost. But let's put this into perspective. The two biggest things, the worst things that I would say that have happened in my life, which happened this year, would be the transition of my career and breaking up with my girlfriend. And if you put that into context compared to a lot of other people, like you said, that are going through a divorce or loss of a loved one, or just a number of other things that are really, really tough that people go through, I'm starting to wonder, are these life quakes for me, or are they just things that are happening, and am I still too young to really experience a true life quake?
Well, I think that I think this will qualify as a life quake, actually, in my terminology. Like because of the pileup, I think either one of them could have
Mm,
been a disruptor.
yeah.
Sometimes it is a clumping that makes them a life quake. So I think that the pandemic,
Yep.
the job change,
Yep.
the economic change, like some job changes don't come with economic change because you go from one job to another, right?
Hmm.
You didn't have time to prepare. You didn't taper off the old job and then taper up the
Right.
new one. The door shut, and you had to then go open another door, and
Yep.
then the breakup on top of it. And again, to echo the kind of the what I found in these conversations was I don't know the details. It may just be coincidence,
Hmm.
or it may be one of the things that really kind of jumped out at me is that what happens is that our immune system gets weakened, and so something that would be a small change becomes a big change.
Mm,
So again, I don't know the details of your circumstance, but just
sure.
to generalize, sometimes we lose our job. I talked to somebody. Okay, I'll use an example from my book. Will Dana was the editor of Rolling Stone when Rolling
Hmm.
Stone ran what we now know to be the um, hoax about a UVA fraternity sex party, and he
Wow.
ultimately lost his job as a result of this. He had
Mm,
been in a difficult marriage for a long time, and then in the middle of this, he was at an event. He ran into somebody. There was a spark. There was a relationship, and
mm,
it was sort of like, you know what? The house is already burning down. I might as well throw another log on the fire. So that happens as our immune system gets weakened, and what would be otherwise a small change
mhm.
becomes becomes a big change. But what I was going to say, not only do I want to say that there are stages you can go through and there's tools you can use, and not only do I have confidence you'll get through it, I'll go one step further, Dan, and I will say that you're building up the skill set. You are sharpening the tools in the toolkit
Mm,
so that the next time you have an event of this nature, you'll be more deft in going through it. And that's
yep.
what we often don't look like. I mean, I actually, you know, I'll divert a little bit and talk a little bit about college, because I think college is normally the first kind of collective voluntary life quake that many people go through.
Mm,
What is college? Let's layer onto it the 3 stages of a life transition. It's the long goodbye, where you say goodbye to that old life, being taken care of, having the food served for you, and having, shelter, every decision made for you. There's this messy middle where you're shedding certain habits and you are experimenting and trying on new ones. I don't like that major. I don't like that class. I don't like having this. Do I want to be someone who drinks a lot or doesn't drink a lot? Do I want to be someone who sleeps around or dates monogamously? You experiment with, different career paths, social lives, friends, etc. Then there's a new beginning where you unveil your new self and you leave that old world behind. You have a ritual to say goodbye, and then you're on to your new life. And what's the average length? 4 or 5 years. What is college? 4 or 5 years. And one of the kind of the sort of side fantasies that I have is that we should rebrand college as a kind of factory to teach life transition skills. That's not how we talk about it. We think it's a one-off. In fact, it is a perfect little microcosm of what you're going to have to go through multiple times in your life. So while you're going through this, one of the things that I've tried to do in this book is kind of give a language, embrace it as nonlinearity, see it as a transition, identify I'm good at the new beginning. That means I have to work at the messy middle, as you said, or the long goodbye. No, I'm good. Fear is my default emotion. Am I fearing fear next time I go through this? All of this will be helpful. And I think that, and I've been kind of frustrated by this. I feel like I've been wandering around my home for years, muttering to myself, people should be talking about life transitions. Life transitions are really important. Like, why aren't we talking? Why hasn't there been a major book on this in 40 years? And now we're all going through it. And I think that's one of the reasons this book, as you said, has landed, made the bestseller list, because people are realizing that they need these skills and they want to get them.
Yep. There's something I came across today as you were talking about everything you just mentioned. I came across it. I just brought up my phone here. Jay Shetty. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Jay. He's actually a monk. He's an author. Focuses on a lot of like self-development things and just self-improvement, improving your relationships. Let me see if I can find this real quick. He's talking about change and how it's okay to, start from scratch. Let me see if I can find the actual quote. I don't think it was something he said. I think it was just something that he came across and posted on his Instagram. And I have it here. He said, or whoever said this, don't be afraid to start over again. This time you are not starting from scratch. You are starting from experience. And there's something you said in there that kind of struck a chord. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
It gets back to the kind of the theme that we've been talking about off and on in this conversation. Are we going to view these life quakes as aberrations? Or as, I don't want to say old friends who are coming back to see us, because often they are triggered by unpleasant experiences, but are we going to treat them as aberrations, or are we going to treat them as regular parts of life that will come at us? There was a book called Passages, written by a woman named Gail Sheehy in the 1970s. It was an iconic book. I usually say our mothers all read it, but in your case, it was probably your grandmother. But the subtitle of that book was The Predictable Passages of an Adult Life. And it said everyone does the same thing in their 20s and then has a kind of the same crisis at 30. Then everyone does the same thing in their 30s and then has a midlife crisis at 39 and a half. This is the book that popularized the idea of a midlife crisis. It turns out, as I said earlier, that's bunk, that these crises have nothing to do with birthdays that end in 0. They have to do with 100 other circumstances, and they happen when they happen, often when you least expect them or want them to happen. But the subtitle, The Predictable Passages, no, they're not predictable. It's predictable that you're going to have them, but when you're going to have them is not predictable.
Right.
So if every time it happens, my father was in the Navy, and as we talked about at the beginning, this was inspired by my father's kind of suicide spree in his late 70s. And what really kicked us off was seeing my dad using storytelling to update the story of his life as what brought him back to life, which is why the core exercise I'm talking about here is rethinking and rewriting your life story at various times in your life. But my dad had a wonderful phrase, which was, I feel like I made 7 first trips to Paris. And what he meant by that is that every time he went, it was like he had never been before. And he was going to the same 5 places. Like he never was able to get deeper, even though he was a traveler and had been there in the service in the 50s and then with his wife and later with his children. if you have 7 first transitions in your life, then you're not taking advantage of them to realize is that there are parts of it that you're good at, and you should know next time this happens to you. And just take our conversation here. The next time this happens to you, and I hope it's not for another 30 years, but I suspect I'm not going to get my hope. The next time it happens to you, you say, you know what, last time I did this, I was good at the new beginning. So let me go start something. You know, I asked all these people, like, what are 3 personal projects on your plate right now? And it turns out that these projects kind of correspond to what I call the ABCs of meaning. So the ABCs of meaning are agency. That's things you do, make, create. B is belonging. That's your relationships, friends, neighbors, family. And C is a cause. Okay. So just look at your life, right? So agency, what did you do in your transition? You started something creative. You started this podcast. Belonging. Okay. So you left a relationship. You probably didn't go back to dating. Probably you would have rallied on friends and family, but maybe that was hard because of the social distancing we've been obliged to do. Or a cause, like, do you have something that is bigger than yourself, right? Are you volunteering in some way, or working on a political campaign, or a religious institution, or food bank, or giving back? Like, the people who had personal projects, kind of one for each of these 3, kind of were the most balanced and the most able to kind of get through what is fundamentally a moment when the meaning of our lives is kind of sucked out, and we have to rebuild the meaning in a new and intentional and balanced way.
Yeah, it's so interesting. There was something you said there that reminded me, and I don't know if it's anything that you necessarily talk about in your book, but I've read and heard before that if you're going through a difficult time, one of the best things that you can do to help yourself get out of that situation or that grief is to help other people. So if you're in a low spot, actually go out and help other people, and that'll help lift you out of that situation. I'm not sure.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, go back to these ABCs of meaning. I call them your me story, the story of yourself and what you make and create and control. Your we story, your story about your relationships and how they uphold you and serve you and distract you and give you something to do. And then your the story, right? Something that is bigger than yourselves. And kind of what I found is that, so we each have these ABCs in us, but we rank them differently. So let me just ask you. So agency, belonging, and cause, rank them in your life in terms of priority.
In terms of priority, I would say probably belonging would be first. I would say agency probably second, and cause was the third, right? That's the
cause
C.
is the third. So you're a BAC. That's interesting to me because what's interesting to me about that is that your first choice of career, you're choosing to photograph people at moments that the belonging is at the highest.
Yeah.
Okay? So you choose to be around people when they're getting married, when they're friends and family or around them. Like if you were that's so interesting, because if you were not a belonging person, like if you were really a loner, you'd be out shooting hippopotamuses or deer by yourself, but you were attracted to this kind of belonging, like the epicenter of belonging, in the human life, which is a wedding. That's interesting to me. So you're a BAC. So I would say I'm an ABC.
Okay.
So I'm a writer. I've written 15 books. I've been doing this for 30 years. So I'm agency, but I'm incredibly family oriented, and I'm kind of less cause oriented.
Sure.
My wife works with entrepreneurs, started a nonprofit 25 years ago. She's a CAB.
Okay.
So cause oriented, then agency, and she tolerates the rest of us, but it's clearly not, she's very happy at night to go disappear and watch her reality television. And when I'm like, I'm ready to talk to you, she's like, all right, I got to deal with you. So she gives to others, and her relationships, not her children, but everybody else, kind of falls slower down. So what happens in a life? So in a life, I call these the shape of your life, right?
Yep.
What happens in a life quake is that we shape shift. So we have to reevaluate. Okay. So you're belonging oriented, but you're licking your wounds from the relationship that just broke up. Maybe now you're putting a little bit more weight into building your agency side. You're being a creator,
right?
And then you've temporarily had to kind of think of the ABCs as a Lady Justice, but not 2 scales, but 3. And there's like pebbles or coins, and you have to move them around. So Well, in a life quake, you kind of rebalance the basic building blocks that give you meaning.
Yeah, and what's so cool about that is, from my understanding and when I'm listening to, it's not that you can prioritize any one of those three, but they all coexist. They all
Yes.
have like
And if you
equal.
over prioritize one, it will blow up in your face. I mean, it's not that it
Interesting.
will blow up in your face. It will have to be adjusted. So maybe you're a caretaker for your children, right? Or you're a caretaker for an aging parent,
Yep.
and that person becomes an empty nester, or the aging parent dies. Then you want to do something for yourself, right? Or maybe you've been working
Mm,
hard, you lose your job, you want to spend more time with your family, right? Or
mm,
maybe you've been giving back and you burn out,
yep.
and you say, you know what, I just want to take it easy and go write that novel I wanted to do. So
Yeah.
again, we are all sometimes forced, and this is actually something else I want to say. Um, there was a study that came out recently that a higher percentage of women than men have had to step back from their careers because of the work from home and the kids not going to school. And the thing I want to say is that these kinds of decisions and compromises and steps that we take in life quakes need not be permanent.
Mm,
Okay, there's no linear life.
yep.
So what you're doing now, where you are now in this messy middle, you don't have the old relationship. Maybe you're starting
Hmm.
to date or not. It's not really important. Your old business is dead or maybe a little bit dead, but you're doing some to make money while the new
Yep.
one gets started. You're not getting back now, and you're like feel guilty about that. These are not permanent. If all of that worked, if your new business took off, you
Hmm.
had a relationship that ended in a wedding that you couldn't take a picture of, and then you started to help people and give back in whatever way possible, you might want to lock that in forever, but
Yeah.
that's not going to be stable either.
Yep.
So children might come along, bumps in the new business might come along. So uh, everything is, as a friend of mine said about parenting, and I wrote about it in my book, Secrets of Happy Families. Everything is a phase, even the good
Yeah.
parts.
Yeah. Exactly. I think it's super comforting to know that if you're going through good or bad times, it's not necessarily permanent. It's not something that's going to last forever. And there's actually somebody I had on my podcast a few months ago, Dr. Benjamin Hardy. He's a psychologist, wrote a book called Personality Isn't Permanent. And he was talking about how there's things in our lives and things that shape our identity and our personality. And it doesn't have to be permanent. It's something that you can always kind of create. You can create that future self. And I think you're talking about some of the similar things there. So very cool. Well, thank you, Bruce. This has been fantastic. Before I get to my last question I have for you,
Uh-oh.
where would you like people to find more about you? I know you have your website,
Yeah, I
brucefeiler.com. Where
mean,
else can...
well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and
Sure.
I've enjoyed getting to know you a little bit and offering some tips that could help people out there. I'm Bruce Feiler. It's Feiler. You can go to brucefeiler.com and send me an email. Obviously, I'm on all the social networks out there, whatever they are: LinkedIn, Instagram,
Hmm.
Facebook, Twitter. Life is in the transitions. You can get it at any bookstore or order any online seller, and I also say out there, I'm keeping going. I'm doing more stories now, talking to people about their lives, talking to people about work-life balance, these kinds of issues. So if you've got an interesting life story or know someone who does, please reach out and share a name. Uh, I'd love to hear your story.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'll be sure to include all of your links to your social profiles and your website in the show notes in the description for our listeners to easily access. My last question I have for you here is, and obviously you would like to impact everybody, but who do you want to impact the most with your work? If you can look at the camera and talk to one, specific group of people, who would that be, and what kind of message would you like to leave them with?
We had that exchange earlier where we talked about people who feel afraid, right,
Hmm.
or sad or ashamed. I want to talk to the person who lay awake at last night and worried um, about some problem that they're experiencing, or got up this
Mm,
morning with a cup of coffee and stared out the window and had a hard time getting out of that chair, kind of wondering how
mm,
they're going to get through it. And what I want to say is, I was where you are,
mm,
and I went out and I met hundreds of people who are where you are, and frankly, in many cases, a lot worse. And it's not just that meeting them gave me hope, because it did do that, but it gave me practical things that I can do tonight, tomorrow, next week, 6 months from now.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I learned is that life gets you stuck, and the life transition is how you get unstuck. So whatever you're dealing with, I want to say, if you come on this journey with me, I'm going to help you feel, whatever transition you're going through, we're going to make it go a little bit more easily and a lot more effectively. We can get through this time together. There is wisdom out there that can help.
I love that, Bruce. That was a beautiful message, and I hope those that are listening that need that message can take that and apply that to their lives. So thank you again for your time and for sharing your message with my audience.
Thank you, Dan. You'll get through this. Keep in touch and let me know how it works out.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Okay, bye-bye.